right. Well, good morning and good afternoon. There we go. All right. Well, good morning and good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants event. My name is Joe Grabowski, and I'll be your host for today. I want to give a huge shout out to everybody who's starting to join from home. It's so great to be continuing the learning, but this time broadcasting live into homes of parents, educators, and students all across North America. So we've got a great virtual field trip lined up for today. We are joining the staff at Ripley's Aquarium of Canada in Toronto, Ontario, and we are about to dive into their most biodiverse exhibit, the Rainbow Reef. So it should be a lot of fun today. We've got Tally, who's going to join us and tell us a little bit about what we're seeing, and the diver today will be Danielle, who's going to hit the water shortly. So Tally, it's so great to have you joining us live today. We love visiting the aquarium, and it looks like the action's already started.
Yes, perfect. Thanks, Joe. So my name's Tally. I'm one of the educators here at Ripley's Aquarium of Canada, and I'm standing in front of our Rainbow Reef exhibit, which is our fourth largest exhibit here at the aquarium, but our most biodiverse. So there are over 1,000 fish inside this tank from over 100 different species. We also have a very special guest joining us today. This is Danielle. She's one of our divers here, and she's going to be giving the fish some lunch. So our Rainbow Reef exhibit usually gets fed about once or twice every single day. Most of the fish in here are omnivores, so we'll try and give them a mix of veggies and protein. So that could mean anything from green leaf lettuce to krill, which today Danielle has in that little high-tech square bottle, and she's giving them to the fish right now. So I mentioned there are over 100 different species of fish in here, so we're definitely not going to go over every single one of them. That'd be a bit of a pop quiz for me and not very interesting for you guys. But we are going to talk about a few of our favorites. For example, my favorite, I always like to mention this fish is probably the least favorite of our dive team, and it is these girls right here, the orbicular batfish. So they are quite large compared to the other fish inside this tank, but they can actually get up to 50 centimeters, so almost 2 feet long. So they still have some growing to do. And the reason that I mentioned that our divers don't like them so much is because they're notorious for biting. So you might actually see that Danielle has her hair wrapped up right now in a little pink scarf there. She's actually protecting her long blonde hair because these fish are notorious for giving out unintentional haircuts. So a lot of people ask us if our divers are ever worried about getting inside tanks full of sharks and stingrays. It's actually our Rainbow Reef exhibit that our divers have to watch out for. All these tropical fish are known to peck at our divers from time to time. There's one fish in here that you guys probably recognize from a very popular Pixar and Disney movie. There's one right over there on top. You might be able to see her in the distance. You guys might know her as a Dory, but we know her as a palate surgeonfish. And palate surgeonfish get their name from looking like a painter's palette, but they're also part of a family of animals called surgeonfish, unicornfish, and tangs. And they all have something pretty cool in common that has to do with their tail. So on the tail of those palate surgeonfish, they have a really sharp spine that grows on either side. There's actually a bunch of palate surgeonfish right here. A sharp spine on either side of that tail, said to be as sharp as a surgeon's scalpel, and it's also mildly venomous. So if we were to get pricked by that, it wouldn't be too bad. It would be just a mild irritation, but it can actually kill anything that is trying to go after those blue tangs. So it's their form of defense. There's another fish in here that you guys might recognize. See if we can find them. We have some clownfish in here. There's one in the corner, but usually they like to hang out in this corner around the back. We have two kinds of clownfish, otherwise known as Nemo. We have some peacock clownfish and some tomato clownfish. The peacock clownfish are a little bit larger. They're just a couple centimeters larger than the tomato clownfish. But you might actually hear our aquarium biologists refer to them as anemone fish due to their symbiotic relationship with sea anemones. So sea anemones are a flowery type animal that have venomous-like tentacles. And they like to sting any prey that might come up to them. Now, clownfish are actually immune to that stinging. So scientists think that it either has to do with a mucus covering their body or some form of coevolution over time. And they form a mutually beneficial relationship by essentially living inside that anemone. They have a pretty high-tech security home living inside there. And in return, they will actually protect that anemone from any predators. Also, a pretty cool thing about clownfish is they practice something called protandry. So there's usually a hierarchy within the school of clownfish. And at the very top of that hierarchy is the strongest, the most aggressive female. And the top female and the top male will be the only ones that are mating. And essentially, if that top female was to ever disappear or if she was ever to die, that top male would actually replace her and he would turn into a female. So all clownfish are actually born as male. Another fish in here, trying to find one with a horn for you guys. We have some blue spine unicorn fish. There's one zooming along right through there. So these guys have that horn there, makes them look like unicorns. And the cool thing is scientists don't actually know anything about that horn. They could be used for defense, could be used for offense, could be used for communication, but they aren't entirely sure. These guys can grow and live up to 50 years, and usually the males will have a more developed horn. So sometimes you can gender them that way, although that might be pretty inaccurate. And there's one other fish I always like to point out. Over here, we've got some pajama cardinal fish. So they're hanging out over top of this piece of coral, and they're pretty notorious for hanging out here permanently. They never seem to move, so we can always rely on them during talks, and we can always point them out. They're quite small, but they hang out in the back there. And they look like they're wearing pajama cardinal fish. Danielle, see how she's doing. Looks like she's finished with that krill there. And she's moving on to scrubbing, just keeping our coral within this exhibit nice and clean. A little bit about the coral inside this tank. It is actually 100% artificial. You might have thought it was real. It looks quite realistic, but it's actually made out of concrete, rubber, and non-toxic paints. And all of the coral that we have here at the aquarium is artificial. The reason being that is that it can grow quite quite slow at a rate of like 2 millimeters every single year. And so we ended up actually just having false coral because we thought that that would be very unsustainable. Why don't we turn it over to questions if you guys have any questions about coral conservation?
All right, that sounds good, Tally. Thanks so much for giving us a little introduction to the Rainbow Reef. Definitely a lot of activity going on right now. All right, well, let's give a few shout outs. So I want to give a few shout outs to some groups. We've got Kinley hanging out in Winnipeg, Manitoba, Henry and Eddie viewing in Rockwood, Ontario. Mrs. Langer's got some of her class joining us live today. Let's see, Kayla joining us from Ontario. We've got some students, some Prescott students joining us from Spruce Grove, Alberta, Jennifer in Minnesota. So lots of great groups joining us live today. Keep introducing yourselves and we'll make sure that we work some of your questions in. So let's get started here. Our first question, Henry would like to know, how do you make sure all the fish got a chance to eat?
That's a good question. So Daniel comes in here once, twice every single day, and providing live food gives the animals actually a form of enrichment, a chance to kind of hunt for that food themselves. The reason that they're fed every single day is to make sure that they get enough food so that ideally each one is getting enough for their body weight. All
right. Let's see, slide down, grab another question here. This time we're going to go to, there we go. Jennifer's wondering, normally, how long does it take for coral to grow?
Yeah, so there's over 600 different species of coral. And so each one grows at slightly different rates. So they can grow at rates of 2 millimeters every single year to up to 10 centimeters every single year. So essentially a species like this one over here, this is modeled after some brain coral. This small green section here would actually take hundreds to thousands of years to grow.
Okay, so we've got a couple questions coming in right now. There's we've got Sidra and Maymuna joining us from Mississauga, and they're wondering, for fish that size, approximately how much do they eat in a day? How much food do they need?
That's a good question. It depends on the species. I only know just how much we feed them. So for our fish, they'll get several hundred different live brine shrimp, or sorry, live krill within that bottle. And then they'll also get a couple heads of green leaf lettuce. And that's usually enough to feed this entire exhibit.
All right, very cool. Let's see. Eddie would like to know what can be done to help protect coral reefs.
Awesome. So coral reefs are extremely sensitive. So if you guys had tuned in yesterday to our Facebook Live talking about live coral, you might have heard coral is an animal and it's extremely sensitive to climatic changes, things like temperature rises, maybe changes in salinity. Even things that are in our sunscreens can negatively impact coral. So things that you guys can do are check your sunscreen. So make sure that there's nothing like oxybenzone in there that promotes coral bleaching. You can reduce your carbon footprint to help protect a lot of these species. So one simple thing I always like to mention is if you are charging your phones at night, if you actually unplug the charger in the morning, it's still using electricity when it's plugged into the wall and it's not plugged into your phone. So it's a little minor thing that you guys can do. Right now is a perfect time to go for walks, bike instead of taking public transportation or taking cars. Even eating sustainable caught seafood. So checking the label a little bit as you're going to the grocery store, maybe check a couple, it might say something like checked by MSC or OceanWise approved. And that means that it was caught in a way that we can ensure it wasn't damaging our reefs or any of the ecosystems in the ocean.
All right. So Natasha's curious about the temperature of the water. Is that nice warm water for Danielle?
Yeah, it's a lot warmer in here than it is outside. It's about 24 degrees Celsius. So the tank is meant to mimic an Indo-Pacific ecosystem. So something we would find near Australia, because that's where over 90% of the world's coral actually grows.
Okay. So we have, looks like Ryan and Alex tuning in with us, and they've both sent in a question each. So Ryan's first question is about how deep some of these fish can swim. Obviously, coral reefs are close to the surface, but can some of these fish go down deeper?
They can to an extent. So yeah, coral reefs are usually found in shallower waters because they need access to the sun. So coral is actually an animal and it has a mutual relationship, a symbiotic relationship with algae that photosynthesizes. So it can't be too deep. And a lot of these fish that live in a coral reef ecosystem depend on coral reefs. So they wouldn't be found any deeper than coral is found. So usually within a couple dozen meters of the surface. If these fish go too deep, they're not very well adapted to the pressure that is found down there. So similar to how Danielle, she's not very well adapted, the fish wouldn't be very well adapted down there either.
All right, so Alex was wondering about the species of fish in the tank. We may have touched on this at the beginning, but can you remind us how many species are in the reef tank?
Over 100, so it's our most biodiverse tank.
All right, very cool. Pretty awesome to watch the fish doing their thing. All right, let's see, next question. Okay, so Melissa is wondering about cleaning the tank. So we can see Danielle is kind of scrubbing the coral. What else goes into keeping the tank clean?
So with all of our exhibits, we'll usually have one of our aquarists or our divers enter in order to scrub at the rocks, clean off any of the algae that's growing there, possibly wipe the acrylic to make sure it's nice and clean for looking into. But then there's water quality testing as well. So our aquarists will ideally test the water of every single exhibit every few days or every single day to test for things like the pH and maybe ammonia levels, test for salinity, because there's very certain conditions or very specific conditions that each fish prefers to live in, and some fish are more sensitive than others. So there's also a life support systems team here at the aquarium that will help with that. So there is a lot of maintenance that takes place into making sure that the environment is good for these animals.
All right. Let's see. Okay, so here's a question from Marina. You showed us the unicorn fish. Do you know why they have that horn feature? Is it does it serve a purpose?
Yeah, so researchers are still trying to figure out. So here's one up here. So they assume it's probably something to do with offense or defense, but they aren't entirely sure because they haven't seen it in use in the wild. It could be a way for males to show dominance over other males, but they're not sure. They're still learning a lot about these guys.
All right. So this is an interesting question. I'm sure it's come up before. Edie is curious about, maybe in this tank, it's not as much of a problem, but in a tank like, Dangerous Lagoon, how do you keep the fish from possibly eating each other?
Good question. So with a lot of these fish in here, the other fish are much too large for them to eat. So that's not a huge problem. They eat things like krill that we saw, very, very tiny. With the sharks, we actually make sure that they get overfed slightly so that they don't start eating our other fish in there. But also, I think they're pretty well used to having our aquarists deliver them food that's been prepped, that's being delivered straight to them. They know over time that they don't need to spend energy on hunting when they can just have it delivered straight to them.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so I really like this question. How do coral reefs defend themselves?
Perfect. So that's a good question because coral reefs don't have a lot of defense. So these little guys, they grow as little tiny polyps originally. And these little polyps are similar to sea anemones, and they have stinging tentacles on them, which can help with really small predators. But for the most part, they will protect themselves with an exoskeleton made out of calcium carbonate. So it feels kind of like limestone or chalk. And this can prevent anything from harming it. But they're still really sensitive to anything that's happening in the environment around them, any stressors in the water, which is why it's really important for us to do our part to help protect them.
Okay. So Caitlin is tuning in, and Caitlin wants to know, how do I get Danielle's job?
Hi, Caitlin. So basically, if you are a scuba diver and you have at least your rescue level of diving, so there's your open water, your advanced, and then a couple more specialized courses, you can apply because we're always looking for divers to help maintain the overall health of our exhibits.
All right, there we go. Keep an eye out for opportunities. Get your diving certifications, and maybe you could be featured on a live event cleaning the tank, which is pretty darn awesome. Very cool. Let's see. Okay, so globally, obviously our coral's in trouble. Do you think that it's being depleted faster than it's renewing right now? Do you think we're at that point?
Yeah, I think so. So they say over 50% of the world's coral reefs are at risk right now. And one of their biggest threats is actually us. So a lot of things that are happening in the world, such as global warming and ocean acidification, these are all things that are getting worse as time goes on. So unless we start to do things right now, we might be at risk of losing them all really soon.
All right. So we've got Brooklyn tuning in. Brooklyn's joining us in Milton, Ontario. And Brooklyn's really curious about the bright colors of the fish. Do they get those colors naturally? Is it can it be a product of what they eat? Yeah, what purpose do those bright colors serve?
So a little bit of both. So over time, these fish have evolved to have these bright colors because it helps them to blend in with the bright colors of coral. But also some of these fish actually have the ability to camouflage in, and this can definitely be impacted by what they're eating. So a little bit of both, but for the most part, these bright colors are to help them camouflage in with their home, which is the coral.
All right, perfect. So a few people are curious about, general maintenance around the aquarium. Has there ever been, issues where things have gone wrong with pumps, or, things have needed to be changed really quickly?
So with our aquarium, our life support systems team is on call 24/7. So there's always someone that is here or is at least on call all night in order to kind of prevent that from happening. So we also have backup generators. I know a couple years ago, the aquarium actually did lose power because all of downtown Toronto lost power. But luckily we have a diesel and backup generator. We have 2 separate ones because we want to make sure that nothing ever happens, that any of the life support systems or any of the tank flows or anything like that will never be shut off. So not yet, but we'll cross our fingers.
All right, excellent. Another question about the fish themselves. Do, obviously there's thousands of fish in this tank. Do they ever lay eggs? Is there a breeding that happens in the tank?
So it depends on the fish. So with the clownfish, they are demersal breeders, which means that they'll actually lay eggs and they'll attach to the bottom of the sediment. So they're a bit easier to breed in captivity. A lot of these fish, for example, the pallet sturgeon fish that I talked about, it's hanging out in the back there. They're pelagic breeders, which means they'll actually release their eggs into the water column. So they won't usually do that in a setting like this. We've definitely had clownfish breed here at the aquarium, but not all of the fish will favor environments like this. Just depends on the species.
All right. So a question about the food that you're feeding the fish. You talked about the krill, you talked about the lettuce. Are you able to breed the food that they're eating at the aquarium, or is it all brought in?
So a little bit of both. So we actually do culture live brine shrimp, kind of like sea monkeys, a small species of shrimp, and we actually have that upstairs. We feed that to a lot of our invertebrates and our jellies. Some of it will get brought in shipments like mysos, and so a little bit of both.
Okay, so there's about 100 species of fish in the tank, and Edie wants to know how the species were selected for the tank.
So I wasn't here for that part. I wish I was, but I think it's based a little bit on what kind of fish live in an Indo-Pacific environment. So we wanted to make sure that they'd be species that would favor these temperatures, these salinity levels, this sort of shelter. Also wanted to make sure that there weren't any fish in here that were particularly aggressive towards any other similar species. We wanted to make sure that there wasn't a lot of dominance within the tank from a particular species. We also were careful not to put in fish. For example, you have to think about what these fish eat in the wild. So parrotfish, they tend to eat algae off of coral reefs, and so we were careful not to put any live coral inside this tank if there were any fish in here that would eat live coral. So it all goes into thinking about what species we would put into an exhibit.
Yeah, and I bet some of it too is just, a lot of knowledge about, what kind of species do well in captivity. I think that's a neat thing too, is a lot of aquariums, I know you guys communicate and sometimes will share species and things like that. So definitely building off of past successes too can help understand what's a good fit. All right. Tally, can you still hear me? I don't know if I can hear you anymore.
Yeah, I'm still here.
Okay, perfect. Good. Good. Let's see. Okay, here's another good one. So the coral in the tank isn't real, but are there other exhibits in the aquarium that do have real coral?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked. So we do have one small exhibit called the Living Coral exhibit, which is in our gallery right past the cafe area. It's right beside our seahorses. And we do have a small selection of coral within there from, I think, about 30 to 40 different species of coral. We also have something going on in there called coral fragging, which is something that's done in the wild to promote coral regrowth. So a couple of our aquarists have started breaking off small fragments of the existing coral within our living coral exhibit. And then these small fragments will actually grow into separate sections or separate colonies that they can put into that reef.
All right, so we've got a question here about coral bleaching. And the question is, how long can the coral last or survive after a bleaching episode? And maybe I'll just add to that at the front, just in case people don't know what bleaching is. Can you tell us a little bit about bleaching?
For sure. So coral exists as a little polyp, almost like a little animal, and it has a symbiotic relationship with algae, which comes in and produces a lot of food by photosynthesizing. Now, coral itself, those little polyps, they're very sensitive to any water changes, any stressors in the environment. And so, for example, let's say there was a 1 or 2 degree Celsius temperature change in the water and the coral got stressed out. It would actually spit out that colorful algae. So it would only have that coral polyp existing. So coral bleaching is basically a mass event of this happening, and it doesn't necessarily mean that the coral itself is dead. Coral will spit out that algae to kind of help them better survive any short-term stress, but if that stressor isn't resolved within a certain amount of time, then that coral reef can definitely die. How long coral can survive without algae is just dependent on the species. Some of it is a lot better. We have some cold water species that actually live right off the coast of Canada that don't need to rely on algae, so they're definitely better off. But ones that live in tropical regions are much more vulnerable to that.
Okay. So a question from Aiden. Aiden's really curious about if there's any plant life in the tank. I know you talked about algae constantly has to be, cleaned. Is there any plants in the tank at all?
There's no plants inside this tank. In order for that, we would have to have some sort of UV light above in order to allow that to grow. And because our divers are also constantly getting into this tank and scrubbing and kind of bumping into this stuff, we were pretty careful about what we wanted to put inside this tank that was live.
Okay, I'm going to hit you with 2 more questions, Tally. The first one is from Claire, and Claire's curious about the fish in the tank. Do the fish actually sleep, or are they kind of awake all the time, maybe resting part of their brain at different times?
So it's hard to say. There's not a lot of research done on whether large species like that would sleep, or how you can tell they're sleeping, I should say. So for sure, dolphins, as you might know, they shut off half their brain while they're sleeping, but they don't know for sure if fish would act in the same way. A lot of the fish in here, as well as they're resting, they'll actually go into a more sheltered spot. So sometimes we'll see them just kind of resting in the coral. But whether they're just resting or they're actually sleeping is hard to say, because they don't have eyelids. They don't shut their eyes as they sleep like we do.
All right, we'll hit you with 1 more before we hit 1:30. And this question's about what corals feed on. So what would corals be feeding on in the wild?
So they would use that photosynthetic algae that lives inside of the coral. They would use any of the energy that that algae produces from the sun. But some species of coral can actually stun and kill their own prey by using those stinging tentacles they have, similar to a sea anemone. So they'll eat small things like krill and small crust they'll consume from that algae.
All right, very cool. Well, first of all, I want to start off with a huge thank you to everybody who tuned in via YouTube today. We had clear across Canada. We had some groups joining us in the US. It's always great to see so many students learning right now and asking great questions. And then obviously a huge thanks to everybody at Ripley's today, especially Danielle in the water. Looks like she's working hard on those coral. And Tally, thank you so much for being here as an awesome educator and giving us all the cool coral facts that we need.
Perfect. Thanks, guys. And also, we are doing another session tomorrow if you want to join in about seahorses.
All right. That's absolutely correct. Tally, you kind of broke up a little bit on that last little bit. Can you still hear me?
Yep, I can.
Beautiful. So you're right. Tomorrow at 1 p.m. Eastern, if you join us, we are going to check out the seahorses. So yeah, that should be a lot of fun. Looks like they're lined seahorses.
Lined seahorses.
Perfect. So we'll see everybody back here at 1 o'clock tomorrow to check out the seahorses. Again, Tally, thanks so much. Lots of fun to check out the Rainbow Reef today.
Perfect. Thanks, guys. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.